There's an allegation that 36% of new voter registrations last year in Michigan did not have valid Social Security numbers. 36% of all the new voter registrations did not have valid Social Security, which kind of means they were not citizens, right? I don't think those were typos. They're not citizens. And then on top of that, Michigan has allegedly 500,000 more voters registered than they have voting age adults. So there's a whole bunch of sketchy non-voters or people maybe shouldn't have voted in Michigan. So State Senator Johnson is the one sounding the alarm about this, and he's pointing to the Help America Vote verification system. So I guess there's something that would solve this. The 36% applied to 100,000 people. So 100,000 people registered to vote in Michigan, and 36% of them, 36,000 people, did not have a valid Social Security number. and they were allowed to register anyway. Now, how in the world do you imagine that's a credible voting system when you're asked to give your Social Security number, but when your Social Security number is invalid, it doesn't change whether you can vote? Does that look like they're even trying to have a credible system? Or does it look like no matter what the situation is, if you're going to vote Democrat, you're definitely going to be able to vote? It kind of looks like the latter. Pretty sketchy looking. But I feel like there's a version of Gell-Man amnesia that applies here to our election systems. Now, I'll remind you what Gell-Man amnesia is. Most of you have heard it 100 times. But that's the idea that there was this physicist, his name was Gell-Man, and he noticed that when he saw stories about physics, and he knew what was true and what wasn't, he could tell that the story was fake or full of errors. But then he would turn the page on what was the newspaper at the time, and he'd see the next story, and he would just assume that the next story was probably accurate. And finally, after seeing that pattern for years, wait a minute, could it be true that every time I see a story that I know the truth, I can tell the reporting's wrong, but every time I see a story where I don't have any expertise, I assume it's true? Isn't it more likely that they're all fake or nearly all fake? And so that's the Gell-Man amnesia. But there's a version of that we do, and it's not that, but I'm sort of reminded of it, and it needs its own name. We'll call it the SCOTT ADAMS the SCOTT ADAMS amnesia. Yeah, that's it. Let's call it SCOTT ADAMS amnesia, because you get to name it after who comes up with it, right? So SCOTT ADAMS amnesia is that you read a story in the newspaper about, let's say, the charities in Minnesota stealing $1 billion. And then you turn the page and it's a story about some other criminal behavior in the government. And you turn the page and you find out that some other big money entity was also stealing your money. And then you turn the page to the story about our elections, and it says our elections are pristine, even though they're run by different people with different processes and different states and precincts. Every one of them has got a pristine, perfect record. And even if there was some little problem, it wouldn't be anything important. And so we live in a world in which everything is corrupt except for our election systems. Now, SCOTT ADAMS amnesia says you could not possibly believe that our election systems are pristine if you've noted that every other fucking thing is not. Right? You don't have to have specific information about what's wrong with our elections. You don't need that. You don't need specific proof. You don't need a court case. If everything else is corrupt, come on, everything else is corrupt. This is the one thing that's not. you would have to have some form of amnesia about everything else you'd seen in the world to imagine that this one thing is the non-corrupt thing. Sorry, not buying it.